Get started here. Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's Zoom into Nature, the Land Conservancy's evening webinar series that covers a wide range of nature topics from flying squirrels to tiger beetles to Ohio's native orchids. Tonight, we welcome Judy Semroc for her program Ephemeral Excitement, the spring rush for sunlight, nectar, pollen, and love. I am Renee Barranca, the Director of Conservation, Education, and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. At the Land Conservancy, I develop virtual and in-person programming for people of all ages. I'm very fortunate to be able to host our field trips within the network of conservation properties the Land Conservancy has protected in Northeast Ohio, which totals over 75,000 acres of natural landscapes, family farms, and urban green spaces. Tonight, Judy will showcase how plants react to our region's warmer temperatures and longer days. Spring is an amazing time in nature. Just this morning, I had the good fortune to join researchers from Case Western Reserve University while they surveyed salamanders at one of the Land Conservancy's conservation easement properties. These were a species of mole salamander, and they spent winter underground until the perfect conditions of rain and warmth urged them to make their way to vernal pools, where today we found many of them breeding. It's a sure sign of spring, and I look forward to learning more about our spring ephemerals this evening with Judy. As always, please remember to place your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll spend time at the end of the program covering your questions. It's my pleasure to introduce Judy Semroc. Judy is an area field biologist and naturalist who loves to learn about and share her passion for the natural world through interpretive hikes, programs, and photography. She has co-authored 2 natural history guides, Dragonflies and Damselflies of Northeast Ohio and Goldenrods of Northeast Ohio. Judy is also the founder of Chrysalis in Time, the first Ohio chapter of the North American Butterfly Association, and serves on the boards of the Ohio Biological Survey, as well as the Conservation Committee of the Ohio Ornithological Society. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Renee, and welcome everyone this evening. I hope you're having great weather wherever you are. We had a beautiful day here in Northeast Ohio, so it's time to start talking about the great plants and insects we hope to see soon. This first photo is showing just a carpet of spring beauties that I hope soon will be out and about doing their thing, and we'll talk about a lot of the insects that will be sharing that time as well. So with that, I'm going to go through some definitions here, some terms so that we're all on the same page. So a spring ephemeral describes the habit of perennial woodland wildflowers, which develop aerial parts, stems, leaves, and flowers, of the plants early each spring and then quickly bloom and produce seed. The leaves often wither, leaving only the underground structures, the roots, the rhizomes, and the bulbs for the remainder of the year. So here's a nice carpet of Trillium grandiflorum, white trillium, which we don't see very often anymore here in Northeast Ohio, mainly because of a lot of deer damage and forest fragmentation. So it's really nice to see areas that still have this beautiful wildflower. And I will be talking about, obviously, native plants today, but I just wanted to go over some of the benefits. They're very well adapted to our local insects and environmental conditions. They maintain and improve soil health and fertility. They require less fertilizer and pesticide applications, and in some cases, none. They help prevent the spread of alien and non-native species. They attract beneficial pollinators that are better suited to live in the geographic area of origin, and then provide familiar source for food and shelter for wildlife. And of course, all of that contributes to the overall health of natural communities. And this is a common sooty-winged butterfly on a cup plant, which hopefully we will be seeing a lot of those coming up soon as well. Talking about terms of native, non-native, invasives. Native is a term to describe plants that are endemic or indigenous or naturalized to a given area and geologic time. This includes plants that have developed, occur naturally, or existed for many years in an area, including trees, shrubs, flowers, grasses, and other plants. And of course, across there we have Jack in the Pulpit. And the columbine we have woodland phlox in the middle, and then the columbine, one of my favorites, just because it's such a beautiful and unusual flower. And then our non-natives have been introduced for horticulture, forage crops, erosion control, medicinal, wildlife food, and by accident. Approximately 500 species of plants in Ohio have been introduced since the original European settlement, and some of them are considered naturalized, which is one of what you see here on the picture is the Queen Anne's lace, which is one that is considered a naturalized plant, and some people consider it an invasive plant, but it is the food plant for one of the food plants for the black swallowtail caterpillar. So I like to have it around for that purpose. And then our invasives are plants that have the ability to thrive and spread aggressively outside of their natural range. A naturally aggressive plant may be especially invasive when it is introduced to a new habitat. An invasive species that colonizes a new area may gain an ecological edge since the insects, diseases, and foraging animals that naturally keep its growth in check within its native range are not present in its new habitat. And then, of course, that new habitat may be your backyard and then can spread from there to many other places. So lesser celandine on the left, Japanese knotweed in the middle, and then goutweed on the right. Now, I put these invasives out of control in here on purpose because these are ones that you typically see on the forest floor, that habitat. So a lot of times when you see these, the only thing that you see growing up through them are typically larger trees because they have such a dense root system and such a dense coverage over the forest floor that a lot of our native ephemerals and other plants really can't compete against them. So these are some in particular that can be extremely troublesome, hard to get rid of, and then a lot of them require, an herbicide, which a lot of people are trying not to use. So this becomes a problem for our ephemerals. So I wanted to mention in particular the Norway maple and its negative effects on spring ephemerals because they leaf out early and create a dense canopy which casts quite a bit of shade. That reduces the degree of sunlight that can reach the forest floor or the understory. Their shallow root system creates competition for water and nutrients, which further stresses our native understory plants. And then studies suggest that they release allelopathic chemicals that can inhibit the growth of plants, including spring ephemerals, in and around their root systems, and their presence in the ecosystem can lead to a notable decline in the abundance and diversity of spring ephemerals, which require ample sunlight and early spring conditions in order for them to repeat and go through their proper series of steps in order to get to the point where they could actually be pollinated and then produce seed. So the picture at the top is a Crimson King, which is, one of the Norway maples ornamental types. So that is one that sometimes may not get as large as the regular Norway maples, but a lot of people plant this as a specimen tree in their yard. So just be aware that that is a Norway maple. So getting into a couple other terms, the nectar that a plant secretes is a sugary mix of that attracts the insects or birds that pollinate the flower. So the nectar is usually what many of the insects are after, and the flower or the plant then sort of disguises it so that the insects or birds have to go over with their bodies the pollen in order to be able to cross-pollinate or that as they move from flower to flower. So the pollen is the fertilizing element of the plants, consisting of a fine powdery, usually yellowish, sometimes white, grains or spores, and sometimes in masses. So here's our marsh marigold, and the little tiny dots that you can see at the ends of the stamens are what you can know are pollen, and then the nectar is usually down inside, and we'll talk more about that. So pollination simplified, the dust-like pollen grains are produced on the anthers, which is the yellow feature here in the upper photo, and that anther is the swollen tip of the stamen. In order for a flower to be fertilized and a seed to be produced, pollen must be transferred from those anthers to the stigma, which is the green feature you see coming up through the middle of the plant. Pollen is transferred when the insects attempting to sip from the nectaries at the base of the flower brush pollen off of their bodies onto the stigma of the next flower. When a pollen grain reaches the stigma, it then germinates and becomes fertilized, and the ovules become the seeds which create a new plant. So in the lower picture, which is a picture of a wild geranium, you can see the pollen grains, the yellow grains on the anthers. You can see the green stigma coming up through the middle. And so those are the parts that we know are the important parts for our insects in order to do what we need to do to get those plants where they need to be. So the great spring wildflower rush to bloom. They need to bloom early to gain enough sunlight to properly photosynthesize. So by starting early when the trees don't necessarily have a lot of leaves on them or just starting, this is the part that is very important to them. And when we talked about the Norway maple being problematic, it's because that particular tree and some other non-natives leaf out early, which then block that sunlight that the plants need. So at this early time, the trees, again, either haven't leafed out or just starting, so the sunlight is able to reach the forest floor to provide the energy to these early flowering plants. So we've got a black cherry on the right that's just, the leaves are just emerging, and then this is a shagbark hickory on the left that's just starting to open. And then the insects that pollinate these early plants need to be emerging when the flowers that they can use are available. So one of the ones that I'll talk about are the willows, especially pussy willow, because it is an early flowering plant providing both nectar and pollen to the early insects that are coming out. So the queen bumblebees are emerging from the ground, and some of our butterflies that overwinter as adults, like the mourning cloak that you see in the left picture, they're out early, they need flowers. And for us in Northeast Ohio this week, all this week is supposed to be in the high 50s and going up even into the 70s. So insects are going to be coming out, but we really don't have much in bloom at all. So it's going to be difficult for them. Even the willows, they're just starting to break bud and starting to show the little silky part of the flower, but not really the parts that the insects, the early insects, need. And this is part of the problem with the way our climate is going. When it gets really warm really early, then everything needs to either catch up, and when they can't, then the timing is really off. Caterpillars and larvae that need to feed on the early plant's foliage must be able to finish all of their instar growth stages before the plant goes dormant for the season. So these two pictures are from the West Virginia white caterpillar of the West Virginia white butterfly, and this one in particular, since the toothwort plants that they need to feed on in order to get to their final instar are only out for a very short period of time, they need to, the adults need to meet, they need to fertilize the eggs get laid, the caterpillars emerge, and then have to eat their way through instars in order to be able to get into their position here on the right, where they make this little silken tie around their body in order to make a chrysalis and spend the rest of the season in order to hatch out next year. If they don't have enough food, or they don't have enough of these leaves during the time they go through their instars, then they likely will not make it through to adulthood as an adult flying butterfly. And that species is already globally impaired as it is, and we'll talk more about that later. Temperature fluctuations can have negative effects on ephemeral plants, early blooming trees and shrubs, and their pollinators. So especially at this time of year, we have, like I said, a week coming up of really nice weather. A lot of the plants may start to bloom earlier than normal. And then if we get, like we normally do, get a hard frost or several days of a hard frost, could really put those flowers in peril, because maybe not all of the pollinators were out during the time that the weather was nice. So it sometimes has to sort of start over, or it misses it for that year. It can be very much a problem. American ginger blooms are colored like meat and point downward to attract the flies that are on or near the forest floor and can pollinate its flowers. So the ginger flower, when you look at it up close, it's really a kind of a odd looking thing, kind of like the face of a lamprey almost, but it's got very hairy stems and the hairy part of the back side of the blooms, and that's because, they open early, and you can see where the arrow points to where the bloom is down here under the leaves. And again, when it looks like meat, a lot of flies are attracted to plants that have flowers like that, like the pawpaw flowers, and some beetles as well. Many wildflowers exhibit nectar trails, and these, I mean, other wildflowers do too, but in particular, some of our spring ephemerals are very noticeable in this aspect. The nectar trails are going to be very decidedly looking lines because insects see in UV light, so they really stand out to them. It helps them to find their way to the important part of the flower, which houses the nectar, which is usually down inside or away from the outer opening of the flower, so that the insect has to actually climb over the parts and hopefully get pollen on them in order to cross-pollinate. So you can see those lines, and if we could see in UV light, those line colors would look differently to us. And again, like I said, the flower color and their pattern can be a vital link for them to find the proper bloom at the right time. So certain flowers are attracted to certain insects. The timing has a lot to do with it. What can be very important about that is the fact that all of these plants, there might be multiple insects that will climb over them and get on them for nectar. Maybe not all of them pollinate. Maybe not all of the plants have available nectar or provide nectar. So we've got our Trolleus and Appalachian Violet and our red trillium down here in the lower right. And then some spring wildflower species can take from 1 to 7 years from seed to bloom. Trilliums, some trout lilies. Problematic predators, especially deer, can cause great population declines when they feed on the surface flowers and foliage of these early blooming species. So when they're eating the flowers and they're eating the foliage, then it makes it a problem for the plant to try to photosynthesize properly because they don't have the features which help them to do that. So the deer obviously become a big problem, and that's not a secret to anyone. And of course, a lot of measures are taken with, exclosure fences and all kinds of things to try to keep them away, but they are especially problematic for the spring ephemerals. And then temperatures at the forest floor level largely dictate the rate at which wildflowers will bloom and fade. The longer the colder weather persists, the longer the flowers will bloom, thus allowing time for more insects to visit them and hopefully improve pollination success. So when the flowers start to bloom, if we have a lot of hot weather and sunny weather for days and days at a time, we may find that our spring ephemeral flowers finish up early, because having that extra sunshine and the extra warm temperatures is an indication that maybe, okay, the insects came out, they did their job, they pollinated, so we're going to fold up here, or we're not going to maybe last as long if the forest floor was colder than normal or colder or kept that cooler temperature. For multiple days of cloudy weather, some of the self-pollinating species will begin that process before their blooms fade past the point of being viable for self-pollination. Now I'm showing the bloodroot here and the hepatica, and we'll talk more about both of those species because both of these can self-pollinate, and they do it under certain conditions, and so we'll go over that here in a bit. On rainy days, folded petals also provide an umbrella effect to keep nectar from washing away or being diluted. Here's another example of a hepatica. And while the blooms are opening, or while the petals, and these you're going to find these aren't petals, but while the flowers are opening, when it gets shady or we have a totally cloudy day or nighttime approaches, and then we have rain during the day, you will find that many of our wildflowers are not as vibrant and open for that reason. They are trying to protect their nectar so that it can be a source of attraction to these pollinating insects. And then butterflies and moths will also use wide leaf plants for shelter during rain episodes. This is a West Virginia white hiding under this great little mayapple, and it actually was raining that day when I took this picture. The raindrops don't show up very well in that. So this was a really interesting thing. I was speaking with my friend Guy Denny the day before yesterday, and we were talking about how these bees were coming to his feeder and they were collecting or foraging on the corn dust grains. So I'm going to play this little video here for you and watch the bees as they just continually go through the cracked corn. And what they are doing is they are collecting corn dust grains, CGDs, which are pollen-sized sort of seed dust. They're small little particles and yeast that are found in birdseed, especially cracked corn. The honeybees treat it similarly to pollen, and they pack it into cells in their combs near the young broods for temporary storage. These grains may have limited nutritional value, but bees are attracted to it because it contains some proteins and other nutrients. So right now, these bees are doing this down at in his property in sort of central eastern Ohio, and it's mainly because there aren't really any other plants that are open and blooming at the time for the bees to go and visit. However, if the corn seed has been chemically treated, it can pose a threat to bee health. So if you're finding that the bees are doing this at your feeders, just make sure, or try to be as sure as you can be, that the corn that you're getting isn't necessarily something that has been treated. So you can see the video, you can see them moving here. The next shot is another video, so you can watch them in here. And it's interesting because the birds will not come and feed on either the sunflower, the safflower, or any of the corn while the bees are in there. So they'll fly around, they'll look at it, they'll check it out, but as long as the bees keep using it, they won't enter the feeder areas. And just another view of how, and you can watch individual ones really stick their heads down in there to try to get to the smallest pieces that they can carry away. Okay, let's talk about some plant shapes. Here's our red bud in bloom with our little insects that are visiting it. So the shape of the stage on which these ephemeral spring pollinators perform, we like to see pretty pictures of flowers. So there's going to be several here in a row just because we're ready. We're ready to see flowers. We're ready to have spring come. So squirrel corn, harbinger of spring, purple cress, white trout lily, Virginia bluebells, and cutleaf toothwort. And then our gallery of important spring ephemeral insect pollinators are our bees, butterflies and moths, flies, beetles. And then if everybody can take a look at the wild geranium upper left picture, hopefully you are seeing the little crab spider that has made its way into finding this hapless little insect here, little bee. And again, you can see how this spider really blends in with the center of that flower, which makes it difficult for the insects trying to come in there and do their thing. And then again, our effective tools for nectaring and pollination is a strong tongue. So there's our bumblebee, considered a long tongue bee. And on the right, again, check it out to where you can see this little tongue comes out and it's got little like it curls down into sort of an L shape, so that as they stick that tongue down in there, they can pull pollen back out, or even nectar if they're in the right place on the flower. And then hairy legs and bodies are also very appropriate for this purpose. This is one of our little sweat bees, and you can see all the pollen grains on the body. Same thing with our sweat bee here, upper left. Our red-necked false blister beetle is another one that will crawl around on a lot of plants, including spring ephemerals, and you can see all the pollen on the antenna, the legs, the elytra, and the part of the thorax. And then here's a flower longhorn beetle on the right. And again, crawling all over these plants, getting all this pollen on you, taking it to the next plant is what it's all about for the pollination story. So nectar plants are those which are fed upon by insects or birds in order to obtain energy. The nectar plants are even more useful when they're blooming at the same time that the important insects, or the insects that need to use them, are flying. And then plants that produce nectar can be more attractive to insects than those plants that just offer pollen. So there's our native bees on golden ragwort, andrena species on toothwort, bumblebee on blueberry, and then of course the honeybee on dandelion. And I do put dandelions in here, and I do not remove them from my yard because in most cases, dandelions might actually be the first flower that is out. And even though it is not a native plant, neither are the honeybees as a species, but it's important that they provide a food source to a lot of these early insects that are coming out and then have no other flowers to feed upon or use. Here's our spotted lady beetles on Virginia Spring Beauty, and we're going to take a closer look at Spring Beauty because it's got some interesting features about it. You can see the nectar trails in the pink lines that are pointing toward the center. And notice how those nectar trails, as it gets farther out to the edge of the petal, it opens up more like looking like a little root system. But as it gets closer to the center of the flower, those lines all sort of combine into one. So another clue to the insect, follow this one line, but I'm going to attract you to my flower because I'm going to put out a bunch of lines near the edge, or a bunch of trails near the edges of the petals. So this is our Virginia Spring Beauty. The pink nectar trails guide the insects to the nectar source at the base of each petal. So on the upper left picture, you can see that I focused on the center and not on the nectar trails. And each of those dark spots that you see are actually the spaces between where the petals meet the center of the flower. Small bees, wasps, and flies are guided to the nectaries by a bright yellow spot. So if you look at the picture on the lower right, you can see the yellow arrow pointing to the yellow spots, which then are guiding them to the nectaries, which are closer down into where the stem meets the petals. And then small bees drink the nectar and pack their pollen baskets with the white pollen produced on the anthers. So if you look at the green arrow in that same photo, you can see the white pollen that are on the anthers that will be able to be picked up by whatever insect might be visiting it. And then at night, the flowers close, and they will also remain closed during overcast days, as with most spring ephemerals, mainly to protect their pollen and keep it available on the sunny days when the insects are more likely out and more of them are out. So I wanted to talk about the West Virginia white butterfly because for us here in Northeast Ohio, this is an important species. It is a globally imperiled species, and I'll show you the map of its occurrences. But you can see it here. It does not have any black spots on the wings, whether the wings are open or closed. And it's a very early flyer, but it can be confused with a cabbage white because early cabbage whites, basically the first wave that hatch out, some of them, their black spots can be very, very faint and be very hard to tell. So here's the map in the upper left corner of where West Virginia whites have been reported. Some of those counties now, they have been extirpated, and this is sort of the spread of where they used to be. iNaturalist now has some other different maps that are changing all the time, but we sort of hosted a project here in Northeast Ohio where we try to get people to report any sightings that they have because they fly for such a short period of time. So they are mainly white on their upper side. The veins are sort of outlined in a pale grayish brown with a faint yellow spot on the underside of the forewing and no dark spots on the wings. Typically, when you first see them, there's not a whole lot of plants that are out, and a lot of times you will find them sitting on leaves on the forest floor, so sometimes they can be hard to see. Their flight period is from late March to late May, and in Ohio, we look for them from mid-April to mid-May. So again, you can see how sometimes they can be darker when the wings are open and darker patterning closer to the head, thorax, and abdomen. But again, they don't have the round spots that you normally would see on a cabbage white. They are about the same size, but they have a different flight pattern. They fly typically lower toward the forest floor, and we'll talk more about that, but you can see another one here where all of these sort of have a backdrop of the brown leaves of, what the spring forest floor looks like. They have one brood per season. The eggs are laid singly on plants in the toothwort family. So you can see there's a female here in the upper left. She's curling her abdomen underneath the leaf so that she is laying her egg on the underside of the leaf, which is what most Lepidoptera do to sort of hide the leaf until it hatches and the caterpillar hatches out and starts to feed. And then after several instars, about 5, the caterpillars pupate in mid-June. And from egg to pupa, it takes approximately 4 to 5 weeks, and it can be somewhat weather dependent. Now, what's important about that is that the food plant that the caterpillars need to be out and have good leaf supply during the time that they are going through these instars. So that can be a real problem, especially if the plants die back early, because then there's nothing for them to feed on. So it can be very difficult. And then the pupa overwinter, and from June to the following March, and you can see here's a singly laid egg on a toothwort leaf. So they're obviously small, certainly much, much smaller than a grain of rice. And then as their behavior dictates, they are weak flyers. They typically fly low to the ground, and if they're disturbed, they can fly higher up, but you won't typically see them, well above your head. They'll come back down and then again fly closer to the ground looking for food plants. Or if it's a female that needs to lay eggs, it's looking for the possibility of finding the plants that it needs. Now, remember that butterflies and moths taste with their feet. So when they land on a plant, they can use their feet to tell them, can I lay an egg on this plant or not? And that's what gets them into trouble when they get to patches of garlic mustard. So let's look at our life cycle. Here's our egg laid on the underside of the leaf. When the egg first hatches, the first thing that the little caterpillar does is it eats the eggshell, because not only does it have protein, but it also helps to sort of disguise the fact that there's an open egg, which like some of our predatory wasps, like brackenid wasps, if they find an open eggshell, they will look for the larva. And then the 2 little dark things up at the top are caterpillar frass. So this is a first instar caterpillar, and that frass is as a result of it eating its eggshell. And then it will proceed on from there. It will continue to eat through those 5 instars, and then when it's ready to pupate, it usually picks a woody plant because it doesn't want to pupate on a toothwort stem or leaf, because those will die back and then there won't be much for it to cling to. And it takes this little silken thread, it makes a patch sort of on the stem with the silk from its body, and it will then make this little ring, and it's just sort of a little support system that holds it to the stem. The chrysalis then develops, and you can still see that little silken thread, and you can also see the silken pad that it is on, and it will remain like that until the following March. And then here's the adult back looking again like the adult that you would notice. And all of that has to be done in a very short period of time, which makes it very difficult. So these are some of the important nectar plants for the West Virginia white adults. So during the time that the adults are out, hopefully all of these are out because of whether it's, a climate type situation, but they will use spring beauty, they will use trilliums, violets, toothworts of all species, wild geranium. So they will also use cresses, things like that. So that's all very important for the adults. Now for the food plants, for the caterpillars, they can use cutleaf toothwort, pretty much everything in the cardamom group, in the mustards. So cutleaf, two-leaf, and then there's a cross between those. They call it toothwort X. And then if you can see the great camouflage in the bottom photo, there is that caterpillar that is on a 2-leaf toothwort there, and pretty much in its last instar. So at this point, it will be ready to go make its pupa. But why is the West Virginia white butterfly in peril? A number of reasons: habitat degradation, invasive plants, and chemical use. So the color of the print The text lines up with the border color around the pictures. So basically, they need contiguous woodland habitat, which have the required nectar and food plants. Forest fragmentation leads to flight disruptions and diminished food sources and supplies. So when the forest habitat is broken up into smaller areas with wider expanses in between them, it makes it very difficult because they're not strong flyers and they don't typically fly out into open sunlit areas with no tree cover or no woodland cover to go to the next place. They stay within that little forested habitat. Pesticide and herbicide use in and around woodlots are deadly to them. And again, they need large populations of the proper food plants so that the caterpillars are not poisoned by feeding on the non-native plants with harmful chemicals, which includes garlic mustard, and that's the biggie. And then white-tailed deer feed on both the nectar plants and the food plants that they need, so the deer destroy the important forest understory plants that they need. So again, when you are out looking for them, and do so this spring, because it's really a beautiful butterfly, but it's neat to watch it because it behaves so differently than the cabbage whites. But pulling the garlic mustard is very important because not only do they think it is the proper plant to lay their eggs on because it's in the mustard family. We did extensive experiments years ago and worked at the museum, and we actually followed each of these instars, and if the eggs were laid on garlic mustard after they hatched out of the egg and started to eat the plant, the garlic mustard plant, they never made it to their second instar, so we know that, it was a problem, but we've known that for years. Also, they are allelopathic, so they're sending chemicals into the soil, which pretty much keep them as the main species in and around them so that they sort of dispatch the competition. So we're going to look at some selected spring ephemeral plants. This is a great one because this is showing that on the right, where the blue arrows are, the pollen that was on those parts, look at the difference in color and how robust the flower is on the left. And you can see that the petals are already starting to reflect even more and change in color, because basically that flower is telling the insects, my pollen is pretty much gone, which means you might want to visit a flower on this plant or on a different plant that actually has more of what you need. So that's sort of a signal to the plant that it needs to go elsewhere. And plants will do that so that it can maximize the visits by the insects. So we've got bloodroot, Virginia bluebells, Dutchman's breeches, wild geranium, red trillium, hepatica, spring beauty. We can keep going. Jacob's ladder, marsh marigold, American ginger, golden ragwort, foam flower, yellow trout lily. And again, we've got a variety of colors, blues and whites and yellows. And again, all of these with their patterning, their colors, their time of bloom, all of them are very important. And some insects are very, plant specific. So some are bees that are very specific. These are the types of things that we know about, and we know that the specialist bees have special plants, that's what they use. So let's talk a little bit about bloodroot because it's got a really interesting bit about it. It is one of our first plants to flower in the spring. The flowers close at night as temperatures drop, which protect the pollen at a time when the pollinators are inactive. Flies and bees will check out the flowers, but bloodroot flowers offer no nectar. The female bees will then collect pollen. Mining bees are the primary pollinators, with others being syrphid flies, halictid bees, and honeybees. And when emerging, a single leaf will wrap around the flower, which protects the delicate pink stalk from wind and helps to conserve warmth. The leaves, stems, and rhizomes release red juice when broken, and the leaves continue to grow after the flowers are done, which add nutrients to the underground rhizome, and then they will also die back later in the summer as the plant goes dormant. So upper right photo, you see the flowers, they're open, ready and waiting for pollination. Lower right is showing that single leaf that wraps around the flower stalk, protecting it. The lower left and the middle left are showing the rhizome, and when that rhizome is broken, even the stem too will show a red color. And then the upper left shows those leaves after the flowers have died back. Now, let's talk about the impact of pollination and how this all works. On sunny days, the flowers will open at about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The native bees that are the main pollinators don't really fly well at temperatures below 55. So between that 46 degrees and the 55 degrees, the pollination tasks or duties fall to the flies, which can fly at lower temperatures and serve as secondary pollinators during cooler periods of time. So the highest pollinator activity will occur between like 63 and 68 degrees. But like I said, in that gap between the temperature at which the flowers will open and the temperature at which the native bees will fly, it's up to the flies to get in there and do their thing. Within 12 hours of pollination, the stamens will wither and the petals will fall off soon after. So many of you have noticed that, the bloodroot that you saw on one day, the next day, the petals might all be gone, and that is why. Within that 12 hours of being pollinated, that is another signal to the insects that, okay, the process has been completed on this flower, you need to go visit another flower. The petals will last 3 to 4 days, but they can actually last longer if the temperatures remain below the level needed for pollinator activity. So again, if that stays at that 46 degrees or hovering around there and not a lot of fly visits are happening, those flowers can stay viable for a longer period of time. If by the 3rd day after opening, the flower has not been cross-pollinated by insects, the stamens will then bend forward, enabling the plant to self-pollinate. This is a backup system which allows it to produce seeds even if the weather is poor for insect pollination. So if we have several days of cold weather, no sunshine, this is how the bloodroot can still produce seeds as a result of being able to self-pollinate. And then there's spindle-shaped seed pods, which I'm sure most all of you have seen. They will form under the leaves, and then as those seeds get bigger, the pods get larger. And then each seed has an elaiosome on it, which is a fleshy organ that is attached to the seed. The ants come and get those because they're very yummy, and they will actually carry that seed away and consume the elaiosome. And by carrying the seed to a different location, this helps to spread the seeds and create new plants. So along the bottom, that row of 4 pictures, there's the seed pod forming in the first picture. It's getting more swollen as the seeds grow. If you open the pod, you can see the seeds inside of there, and then the close-up showing that little apron of that elaiosome in white. It's a very important feature, and we'll talk more about that. The skunk cabbage. This is our first flower, pretty much our first spring wildflower, even though it can open in the winter. The flowers are very tiny. They're located on a round spadix hidden within the maroon hood-shaped spathe. So here are the flowers. Well, that's how the spadix will look. The spathe is this maroon-shaped shell sort of around it, around the spadix. And this plant, as we know, exhibits what we call thermogenesis. That is the ability for a plant to metabolically generate heat. The spadix can generate temperatures of 70 degrees for nearly 2 weeks. And insects take advantage of the warmer temperatures. They'll hide inside the spathe. The dark color of the spathe, in addition to the heat generated by the spadix, can melt the surrounding snow, like you see in the upper left photo. The fruit develops once the flowers are pollinated. They turn dark brown in late summer and fall apart in the mud, and rodents may help to spread the seeds. The stigmas, or the female parts, appear first, and then the stamens, the male parts, emerge then at the base of each stigma, which prevents this plant from self-pollinating. Leaves emerge from a single thick rootstock, and they grow very large, 2 to 3 feet, and provide shade to prohibit competing plants around them and add shelter for birds and frogs. So here's our little honeybee hiding inside, staying warm. Here's the actual leaf parts emerging. Here's our little gray tree frog smiling because it's happy, sitting in one of the leaf crouches, basically where the stem goes down through. Here's what the fruit will look like before it turns brown. It's got an absolutely beautiful geometric pattern on it at this stage. Here's that spadix showing the spent flowers, and then here's the emerging leaves and the spadix in the winter while it's melting the snow. Now, if you've never seen the root system of a skunk cabbage, it's pretty massive. It has the flowers have an unpleasant smell, and the foliage, for two important uses. They make the plant unappetizing to most grazing animals, and it helps to attract insects. Certain species of flies can detect the smell from long distances and help to transport the golden colored pollen. The meat-looking color of the spathe also helps to attract flies and beetles. Tree frogs will hide in spider webs that are built across the leaves or the spathe opening. And skunk cabbage may be our oldest wildflower. If conditions are stable, the roots may live more than 200 years. So you can see obviously the spread and why they're so well anchored when they're in the ground and in a wet area. Here is our spring peeper hanging out in the spider web, waiting for something to come by so it can eject its tongue and grab it as it goes by. And then here's our little honeybee that's also using the fact that it can be part of that warmth. So hepatica is another one that has a really interesting way of doing things. Two species are native to Ohio, sharp-lobed and round-lobed, but now they're both classified as Hepatica nobilis with two recognized varieties. So other common names another common name was liverwort, which comes from the resemblance of the leaves to a human liver. Each have 3 lobes, whether they're sharp-lobed, the middle picture on the right, or the round lobe, lower right picture. The leaves are evergreen. They turn brownish purple in the fall, and they are ready to begin photosynthesizing early in the spring before trees leaf out. As the new leaves emerge, the old leaves will die back. Flowers emerge early, mid-April usually. And again, all these dates I'm giving you are for what we see here in Northeast Ohio. The flowers are actually not flowers. They are flowers, but they're not petals. They are sepals. So the coloring are shades of pinks, blues, purples, whites. The plant also provides no nectar. The flowers provide no nectar. The stalks are covered by soft hairs, which help to conserve warmth and protect them from temperature extremes. So here's what some of the leaves look like left over going into winter. They sort of turn more of a brownish color. Here's our sharp lobe on the right. Here's our round lobe, lower right. And then here's the hairs on the flower stalks. And again, the color of those sepals are what we consider the colors of the flowers. And then they can also self-pollinate if insects are absent, but the seed germination is lower than if pollination occurs through insect visits. The exposed anthers attract small bees. That's the little white parts that you see here on the left, upper left and lower left. Excuse me. Small carpenter bees, sweat bees, and mining bees search for nectar, but then return for pollen once the anthers dehiss, releasing the release of pollen through the splitting of the tissue. The redneck false blister beetle, like we saw before, it's a pollen-eating beetle, was found to be the most frequent visitor to hepatica flowers, but since its range is small, it's not a very efficient pollinator. Seeds also have elastomes on them, which are attractive to the ants. They carry the seeds off to feed to their young and then deposit the intact seed near their nest sites. This helps to generate new plants by spreading those seeds around. And the seeds must go through a cold period to break dormancy of the apicotyl before they will germinate. So here's what the little seeds look like inside of the pods. There's our red-necked false blister beetle. And again, pink flowers, blue flowers showing the exposed anthers. And let's talk about the elastomes because they're very, very important. Approximately 11,000 plants possess elastomes. Our North American deciduous forests are a hot spot for those plants that have that feature. 30 to 40% of understory plants have adaptations for seed dispersal by ants, trilliums, hepaticas, bloodroot, violets, wild ginger, and more. Ants are attracted to the lipid-rich appendages, the elastomes, that are attached or on the seeds. They grab the appendages and carry the seeds to their nest. They remove the elastome and feed it to their growing brood of young. And then they deposit the intact seed, sometimes in a waste midden, or they carry it away from the nest site, and which is often a location that is very conducive to seed germination. The soil is usually very good. It's got cover and all that good stuff. The common woodland ant, Ephemeral species, are a keystone disperser of understory elastomes in the North American deciduous forests. So if you look at the panel at the bottom, the hepatica seed with its elastome looks like what's below it. The bloodroot seed looks like obviously the one below it, wild ginger, and then the trillium. Now this next slide's probably my most favorite slide. It's not my shot, which makes it even better, but it's really great because it's so close up. So here are the Ephemeral ants. You can see how they're using their little jaws to grab the seed by its elastome. It will then carry it to its nesting area. Please, if you have the chance to go on Alex Wild's site, he is an amazing close-up photographer of all kinds of little cool things in nature. But this is just such an important way to see how important the ants are to seed dispersal and moving the populations and increasing the populations of these spring ephemeral plants. So the reason I put this in here, because a lot of people tend to spray ants or spray for ants, obviously around their homes, or they step on ants when they see an ant hill or ants coming up in the forest areas. Now you know that seed dispersal is incredibly important as a result of the ants doing their thing. So try not to harass them or spray them or step on them if you can. I wanted to mention early spring trees. So we have our pawpaw trees emerging with leaves and flowers. Red buckeye, even though it's not native, it's one that has become a real favorite. I mean, it's native to the United States, but it's making its way northward. So we have it here in Northeast Ohio, and it does very well because we don't have the hard winters like we've had. This is a favorite of the hummingbirds that come in early. And then as a result, then you can actually get, the actual buckeye seed. If you do and you get them, and you want more red buckeyes, as soon as that seed breaks out of the husk, plant it immediately, because if you let it sit and dry out, it usually does not germinate. American plum on the right, serviceberry flowers and fruit on the lower right, and then our red bud. And then again, I turn the pawpaw stem over so that you could see what the inside of the flower looks like. And it's important because normally, as you can see in the upper photo, it hangs downward. And a lot of the pollinators that can use that, which are typically flies and some beetles, again, meat colored flowers, flowers pointing downward. The attractant is that those insects typically fly lower, and then they can fly up into the flower to help pollinate it. And then a little bit more on the pawpaw. And most of you know that Doug Tallamy has gone through and listed a lot of the LEP species and how many will use different plant species and tree species. The pawpaw, there's at least 12 species of LEPs that use it. It is the host plant for the zebra swallowtail. It is our largest native fruit found in Ohio. The maroon color flowers, again, look like meat and hang downward. In nature, it grows as an understory tree along woodland edges, stream corridors, ravines, and creeks, tolerating most moist soils. They do need a genetically different tree nearby for successful pollination to produce fruit. So additional trees will grow from the main tree as suckers from that parent and produce a pawpaw grove. But for those of you who may have a pawpaw grove and not have a genetically different tree in there somewhere, you may decide, okay, I have this great pawpaw grove, but I never get fruit. That is the reason why you don't get fruit. So take one from another, genetic source, plant it in and among the trees you might already have, and then in a couple of years, it will all work out and you will get fruit. Additional things that use it, box turtles actually love pawpaw fruit, and mammals will eat the fruit and the seeds. So starting in the upper right, those are what the sort of green banana-like fruits look like. It turns a beautiful yellow in the fall. There's our little box turtle that's waiting for somebody to hand them a pawpaw fruit. This is what the seeds look like once the fruit has gone to seed. So the seeds really fill up that entire pod. Here's our zebra swallowtail with the larva or the caterpillar feeding on that. It has very broad tropical looking leaves. And then there upper left is our spring buds. There's a question mark butterfly. And again, great camouflage because it kind of just looks like a leaf hanging there. But question marks and commas actually overwinter as adult butterflies. So when they come out and the pawpaws are in bloom, it's a much appreciated plant. I also wanted to mention willows because willows become a very important plant at this time of year. More than 450 LEP species use willows, a variety of species. Using native willow species is very important. The pussy willow is probably the one that I would recommend for home habitat if you don't have a lot of room. It blooms early. It provides a good nectar and pollen source for those early insects like we talked about earlier. Peachleaf willow, Salix amygdaloides, is suggested for sites with a lot of space. It can get very large. The early flowers, again, are a boon to the early insects, included native bees, early Lepidoptera, queen bumblebees coming out from under the leaf litter. It's very important for them. You can bring pussy willow cut stems indoors to root in water for potential spring planting. And Baltimore orioles frequently use willows for hanging their bag-like nests. So here's peach leaf willow leaves and flowers. I put the Baltimore oriole nest in here because we know that the orioles use a lot of fibrous type materials to make their nests. So one thing, if you had milkweed plants, whether they were common or swamp or butterfly weed, if you left those stems standing through the winter and still have them standing through the spring, if you're dying to get rid of them because you don't like the way they look, just cut them and lay them down because Baltimore orioles will find those stems. They will put their feet on top of it and use their bill to pull the fibers out of the stems of the milkweed plants and then take them to use in their nests. So it really does become a good nesting material. There's our queen bumblebee on the lower left using the flowers, and then again the pussy willow flowers, and here's a picture of the leaf underside of the pussy willows. And then I also wanted to mention weeping willow and corkscrew willows are not natives, but they are typically planted by homeowners. Weeping willows are certainly the number one plant that people plant in their backyard if they have a wet area or some parts of it flood because they think willows will suck up all the water, which willows are very good. They do live in wet spots and they can do that, but other willows that are native can do the same thing. So don't typically plant those willows for that reason. Try to pick a native and then entertain the fact that you will get a lot of Lepidoptera that will visit it and use the foliage, and a lot of insects will use the flowers as well. The nectar is strongly scented and a superior food source. The leaves are favored by mourning cloaks, red-spotted purples, and viceroy caterpillars for their larval food. Male and female sexes occur on separate trees or shrubs. So this is a bog willow, upper right, endangered species for us here in Ohio. Beautiful, beautiful flowers. Diamond willow, Salix eriocephala, in with the leaves with that little red tinge to it. Here's our viceroy caterpillar in the middle, which will feed on the leaves. And believe it or not, willows have also the inside of that, the fluid is also can make the viceroy butterfly caterpillar distasteful. So there's cardiac glycosides and adenolides in that. So while we always thought that the viceroy butterfly mimicked the monarch because the monarch was sort of poisonous or distasteful, we then learned that the viceroy is also distasteful because it feeds on the willows and some other plants as well. Silky willow in the middle, and then black willow in the upper left. And I wanted in particular to point out the red spotted purple, so that grouping of pictures along the bottom. They have a bit of a different life cycle. The adult is on the left, and during the season, it will lay its egg on a willow leaf. So if you're looking at the middle picture, lower middle, and when that caterpillar hatches, it's really small. It's in its first little instar, and it will take silk from its body, and it will attach the willow leaf to the stem so that it does not fall off in the winter. And then it uses its little jaws to cut this pattern out of the leaf, and then it folds it over, stitches it together. So if you look at the picture on the right, it stitches it together, and it looks like a little tunnel in there, and that's where that larva will spend the winter. It is a hibernacula for it, so that in the spring, when the leaves start coming out on the willows early, that little guy or girl will come out of there and immediately begin to eat the fresh leaves of the willow. As a result, then it will go through its instars, 5 instars, earlier in the season than most of our other butterfly or moth larvae, so that then by midsummer or even previous to that, you will start seeing the adult red spotted purples, and then they'll start the process all over again. So right now, if you go out and you're around willow shrubs or willow trees, look for this feature, like a curled up leaf where the silkiness of the attachment is visible on the stem, and you could find a hibernacula of the red spotted purple. So I always have to put this in because I really want to encourage people to minimize their lawn, keep cutting it back, making it into proper habitat, because lawn grass doesn't really help anybody but Japanese beetle larvae and starlings. As the Japanese beetle larvae eat the grass roots, the starlings come in to eat the Japanese beetle larvae. Again, making pollinator and eco-friendly landscaping choices. There are a lot of seed mixes out there now that are very useful for changing your grass into a more useful habitat for our insects. Maintenance costs on lawns: too much money, too much noise, too much time spent watering, gas, equipment, your time. Lawns, again, like I said, provide very little useful habitat. And then most people who have big expanses of lawns do the herbicide, fertilizer, and whole chemical component to that, which then enters our groundwater supplies and poisons our ecosystem, our drinking water, the whole bit. So if you can use rocks, clovers, herbs, mosses, and other short beneficial plant species as grass replacement, it's so much better. And then remember, dandelions, clovers, and other naturalized plant species tolerate pet urine quite well. You don't normally see the big brown spots that you do when you are manicuring your lawn. A couple resources here that mainly talk about these two books, or the two book at the bottom right is about no mow yards. There's also lawnreform.org, which is a good site to go to learn more about trying to minimize your grasses or your lawns in particular. And I will also give other information to Renee that she can pass on with other sources. And with that said, I'm all done. I'm ready for questions, and hopefully I can answer them.
We got some questions, as you can imagine. Oh my goodness. Okay. So let's see here, Judy. If you want to turn your camera back on, Judy, that'd be great.
All right.
And go back
Oh,
to
I'm in the
your
dark.
oh God.
Let me turn a light on. Okay.
Your slide that was titled Willows 2. There was a question about that slide. So I don't know if you can go back a
Okay.
couple here. It wasn't too far back. There you
This
go.
one. Okay.
Folks are curious if how big these are, if they're shrubs or trees, these species.
The most of the willows, if left to their own devices, they will get
Okay.
larger. Some of the species like bog willow, which is endangered for us, doesn't get as large, but black willow can get very large. Some of them look more shrub-like, and like black willow can get more tree-like. We also have crack willow and white willow that are also not native, but they get planted. They're not really the ones of choice. The peach leaf willow that I mentioned, that does get large. And we're talking, 80, 90 feet on some of them. So if you've got a bigger area, 60, 70 on some of them. Pussy willow would be the one that would be the good one to plant if you have like a home garden or a smaller area, because that I've got a pussy willow that I've had. There was a pussy willow here on the property when I moved here, and it's now a tree that's about 30 feet tall. But the other pussy willows I've planted, and I've been here 20 years, they're about 8 feet tall.
Okay.
So that would be the one that I would pick if I were doing it in a yard type habitat.
Okay. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how insects are looking for flowers right now, and there really aren't a lot out there. The question that came up then was, would it help if folks put out diluted honey in a shallow dish?
Well, they could try that, but the insects don't really know that as a form of food, and then you can run into the problems with the dilution rate, because then they can be very sticky and the insects can get stuck in them. That's also a question that I get when people put out jelly for like orioles or hummingbirds. If they don't really dilute it to where it's like water, then these insects and the birds can get like stuck in it because it's very sticky, and they put their feet in it. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that I personally would do the honey thing. Now,
Sure.
more of the areas to the south, they probably already have flowers that are out, so it's not so much of an issue. But right now, like I said, my dandelions aren't even out, but I expect them to be out in the next day or so, which become an actual food source for these insects. The other thing that might work, coltsfoot, which is also not native, but that's an early bloomer that insects can use as well. It's a dandelion looking flower. But some people, if you've got like snowdrops are up now, and the bees are all over it and using them. So maybe if you're planning for next year and you're noticing that your flowers aren't coming out while it's still cold or still early, that might be a bulb to plant next year, so that when it emerges and it's early, you might be helping those early insects.
Question about clovers. Do you recommend best clovers for lawns?
I personally do not spray my lawn at all, and I have lots of clover. I have pink clover or red clover or whatever you want to call it. I have white clover. The nectar content, or the sugars that are really useful in clovers, are actually very good and very high. A lot of pictures that I take of butterflies and other insects are on clovers. And again, because I don't spray, I have a lot of different naturalized, or some people would call them weeds, but because they're low growing, they make a good grass substitute. So pink probably has more attributes than the white, but they also can bloom at different times. White tends to go later into the season. Pinks tend to start a little early, or vice versa. It just kind of depends on where you are and what's happening in your little area of the
Okay.
woods. There's
Um,
also like purple prairie clover and some other clovers that are prairie type plants, but I would recommend looking those up and looking at the type of soil and sun exposure they need in order to be using those with because they bloom a little bit later.
sure. And Judy, you mentioned how the honeybees use dandelion in early spring. There's a curiosity if honeybees will also visit daffodils and crocuses.
They do, because a lot of times the crocuses are up early also with the snowdrops. Winter aconite is another one that people have that come up early, and a lot of insects will be on it. But I also believe that's not native in all areas, so that might be a problem if people are trying to stick specifically to natives.
Mhm.
So that's another one that might be out there as a source. Now, when the stores pretty soon will have pansies and things like that they will offer. Most of those are pretty much sterile in the nectar and pollen department. They're more for show. So some of those people will rush out and buy them because they're anxious to have some flowers blooming, but you may find that they're not attracting any insects because of that. But the daffodils and tulips also, they can get in and use the insides of the tulips, but definitely the crocuses.
Okay, great. Here's someone whose neighbor uses cedar oil to combat ticks. She's wondering if you know if cedar oil affects other insects.
I personally do not know if it does, but
Okay.
I have heard of people who use that.
Hmm.
But I don't know like the application amount and location
Right.
does matter. So I would definitely research before you use anything like that, and really look at where the best placement is for it, because you don't want to, I mean, insects are struggling as it is anyway, so
Hmm.
you don't want to add maybe another feature. So as far as the ticks go, and that a lot of people who want to combat ticks get chickens. But remember, chickens will eat every insect you have. They'll eat all the ants, they'll eat all the crickets, they'll eat anything they can find. So while you think you're getting rid of your ticks, and you may be doing that, you may also be getting rid of the beneficial insects that you are planting to attract
Okay.
with a chicken.
Okay, so we talked a lot about the ants moving the seeds, and the question is, do the ants ever damage the seeds?
No, because that elaiosome is there in order to be taken by the ants.
Okay.
So I suppose if you had an ant with really, hefty grabbers on them and they pick up a
Hmm.
seed, but usually the coating of the seed is so much more durable than what the ant could ever do to it. So ants will also do the same thing with jack in the pulpit seeds and things like that. That's why you find them scattered around. They'll carry the seeds elsewhere, but the eliasome is its goal in life is to be eaten by an ant, and then with the seed being carried to a different location.
Okay. Well, the rest of the questions, I'm going to have Judy answer them directly because they're about specifics in people's yards, Judy. So
Okay, I'd be happy
there's a
to.
lot of questions about native plants, and I shared a link to the LEAP website. We have a wonderful page on native plants that has an interactive map. This is obviously just for the LEAP region, which is Northeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, and the southern edge of New York, but it's a wonderful resource to help you locate native plants here in Northeast Ohio for your gardens. And if we didn't get to your questions, I promise you over the next couple of days, we will respond to them in email. So thank you, Judy, so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks everyone for joining in, and I hope you
Yes.
all have a great week of wonderful weather and bugs and flowers, and get out there and start enjoying it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.